Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Simchak. I'm ESA's Research and Programs Director. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Interconnection Standards, What Project Implementers Need to Know. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available later at www.energystorage.org. Participant lines will be muted throughout the webinar. However, we welcome your questions and comments, which can be submitted at any time via the chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. Following the webinar, you'll receive a link to the recording and slides, as well as a brief survey regarding today's topic and topics for future webinars. Your feedback will ensure that ESA continues to provide the highest value information to you and your company. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members-only area of the ESA website. ESA works to accelerate markets, connect members, and educate all stakeholders. Our members directly influence our educational programming. So if you'd like to learn more about membership value and ad opportunities, please contact Membership Manager Richie O'Neill. His email address is here on the screen for you. Our speakers today are Sarah Baldwin, the Director of the Regulatory Program at the Interstate Renewable Energy Council, and Michael Goggin, Vice President at Grid Strategies. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sarah, who will start off talking a little bit about these issues at the distribution level. Struggling for words there. Sarah, on over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Tom, and thanks so much for the opportunity to present to you all today, and Happy New Year. Before we dive in, hopefully many of you are familiar with IREC, but for those unfamiliar, IREC is an independent not-for-profit organization working nationally and state by state to expand consumer access to clean energy. As shown on the map here, the regulatory team that I direct has been involved in nearly every state over the past 11 years, working on our core issues of interconnection, grid modernization, energy storage, smart inverters, and community solar, among other distributed energy resource policies. And our focus within our regulatory program is really streamlining the integration of distributed resources on the grid to optimize their benefits for both consumers and the grid, and optimize environmental benefits as well. And I'll be using the term DERs today just to spare my words, as I have a lot of DER references. So today, in the short time I have, I'm going to go over three primary topics. The first, interconnection models and basic components of interconnection and why they matter to you as an industry. The key considerations for the energy storage industry within the interconnection conversations and the issues that we're seeing crop up in a handful of states, and certainly those that we expect to be rising in more places. And lastly, I'll provide a very high-level overview of the recently adopted IEEE 1547 standard for interconnection of distributed resources, and give you a sneak preview of IREC's forthcoming resource on that topic. I'll note that I am repurposing some content from a webinar that we did recently on the IEEE 1547 2018 standard, and would encourage you all to listen to that for a deeper dive and a more technical overview of some of the issues by IREC's Chief Regulatory Engineer, Brian Leidick, who is right now on family leave and expecting a new baby any day now. So hopefully you all understand why interconnection standards matter to the energy storage industry, but I'll take just a minute to state the obvious and compel you to care a little bit more about these standards and the numerous issues surrounding connecting distributed resources to the grid. Interconnection standards are really the rules of the road. They ultimately determine whether or not projects are built, how quickly, and at what cost. So whether you're connecting your system to the distribution system or the bulk system, interconnection procedures and technical standards are the Bible that govern the process and determine whether or not you and your customers encounter a more gridlocked, inefficient, and unpredictable process, or one that's more streamlined, efficient, and predictable. And it goes without saying that the latter is going to be, in most cases, more cost-effective and thus profitable. But beyond all of that, if you don't have interconnection agreements, you don't have projects. And without projects, you don't have a market. So they're really foundational to your business. And despite the fact that energy storage policies and incentives are on the rise, most state and utility interconnection rules were not written with energy storage in mind. Most utilities and regulators lack familiarity with interconnection issues that affect storage and behind-the-meter systems. And it's really, I think, on all of us, those of us who advocate and work in the regulatory realms and with utilities as well as the industry itself, to do some really good education and get folks up to speed on why energy storage should be streamlined alongside other distributed resources. So the good news is that even though the energy storage issues are a little bit more vanguard, there are existing interconnection models to draw from and use. And there are certainly a need to address the more nuanced issues of storage, but we're not starting from scratch. And we can also learn quite a bit from the experience of solar and other renewable energy industries who've navigated many of the interconnection challenges over the past decade. And hopefully energy storage can leapfrog to best practices with this knowledge and past experience. So at a high level, there are two interconnection models that serve as an excellent starting point for states and utilities. FERC's Small Generator Interconnection Procedures, or SGIP. Please note this is different from the California SGIP incentive program. It's a little confusing sometimes. This was developed as a model for state procedures. It was last updated in 2014, and although it pertains to the bulk system interconnections, it's very applicable for state-level interconnection standards. Certainly some modification is necessary for it to be relevant to distribution system-specific issues, but it is also largely considered to be a well-vetted model. There were a lot of utilities and utility trade associations, as well as clean energy advocates at the table, IREC included, developing this model. So it's a very strong place to start from. In addition, IREC's model interconnection procedures were developed to serve as a model for states and was updated most recently in 2013. But I'm pleased to announce that we will be publishing an update to this year very soon, and it will include more specific provisions that impact energy storage. And then lastly, there are a number of important innovations that states are working through and developing right now that are not necessarily captured in FERC SGIP or in IREC's 2013 model rules, and they're worth keeping in mind as the space continues to evolve in response to high penetrations of DERs, as we see more queue backlogs, and as we continue to see forecasts of strong growth for consumer-driven distributed energy resources. So let's see, sorry. Okay, there we go. So ideally, all interconnection procedures should have the four basic components identified at the top of this slide. A pre-application process to allow for information gathering before a full interconnection application is submitted. Secondly, clear and transparent procedures for the technical review of the proposed project. And this includes the technical screens and the different study processes. Third, procedures for negotiation and the execution of the interconnection agreements, including timelines and fees. And then lastly, procedures that govern how construction upgrades need to be dealt with, and not only timelines, but also costs. In addition, within this table, there are a number of other issues that interconnection standards should cover and be clear about. And it goes without saying that all of these include a lot of details. They should not be overlooked for their importance in keeping projects cost-effective and efficient, but I do not have sufficient time today to do a deep dive into these. But IREC does work on interconnection issues in regulatory proceedings across the country. We are involved in, at the present moment, 10 different regulatory proceedings on interconnection. And we have, as I mentioned, our model rules, as well as related interconnection resources that are free to you to use. That help explain both the rationale and the importance of these different topics. So at a high level, as it relates to energy storage, there are really 5 key considerations emerging in the context of interconnection standards. First, the need to ensure that energy storage is actually defined as an allowable technology for interconnection. This may seem like a no-brainer, but there are still a lot of state standards and utility tariffs that are unclear or silent on this key definition. Secondly, interconnection standards should really be clear about when storage projects need to submit an application, what level of review they can expect, and what considerations need to be made based on the different configurations that energy storage and energy storage paired with DG projects bring to the table. This is definitely the most controversial when dealing with projects that are designed to be non-exporting or have limited export and or might have inadvertent export. And as project developers are navigating the interconnection process, obviously the greater clarity you have about how these different systems are going to be reviewed and studied will lead to hopefully fewer disputes and more efficiency for all of you involved as well as the utilities. Thirdly, defining and determining what system capacity is going to be studied for system impacts. Is it the aggregate capacity of the system or the net capacity? For example, if you have a solar plus storage system and you have a storage battery that can do 2 megawatts of storage capacity, and you have a solar PV system that has 1.5 megawatts, are you being studied for the combined aggregate 3.5 megawatts? Or are you being studied for how that system is actually designed to operate, which is going to be likely a lower capacity, given that it's likely there to serve load. Key point here is to avoid the worst case scenario and not being overstudied or over charged for system upgrades. Fourth, you have, in some cases, a need to clarify and eliminate the duplication of an interconnection process in the event an energy storage system has load impacts as well as generation or export impacts on the system. The goal really is to avoid two separate and potentially costly study processes and also more clearly define the cost allocation rules therein. California is a good example of a state that's done a lot of thinking and a lot of navigating of these complex issues as they arise on this front. And then lastly, again, all of the applicable interconnection applications, the agreements, the documents, all need to be updated to allow both developers and utilities to share information and agree to how the storage system is going to be operated, controlled, and used. There are lots of good conversations happening in the states that we're active in, and I would generally say that the more information the industry can bring to the table and the more data and the more real-time field-based information you can provide, the clearer it is going to be for the utilities and the regulators, and the faster we can get good standards adopted. So I'm now going to switch gears to an emerging issue on the horizon, and one that the energy storage industry and all the ER developers and providers should be paying close attention to, and that is the publication of IEEE 1547-2018, the Standard for Interconnection and Interoperability of Distributed Energy Resources with Associated Electric Power System Interfaces. Yes, that is the full title. From here on out, I will call it IEEE 1547-2018. This is the long-awaited update to the 2003 version of the standard, which at the time, 15 years ago, was the first standard to really guide the interconnection of distributed resources on the grid. So take a minute to think about what was happening 15 years ago in your life. For some context, Apple had just launched iTunes, Tesla Motors was just founded, and Internet Explorer was the search engine of choice. So indeed, much has changed since then, and indeed, we have seen a huge growth and uptick in all distributed energy resources. So the 2018 update is really timely and important for a lot of reasons, but foremost among them is that it's really going to transform how distributed energy resources interact with and function on the grid. And as I mentioned, IREC's newest resource, which will be published this month, Making the Grid Smarter, provides a primer on the standard and an overview and explanation of the major revisions within the standard to help states, utilities, and developers work through adopting and implementing the standard. In contrast with the 2003 version, this 2018 version is a menu of options that needs to be considered and selected. And it's going to require a lot of attention by state utility regulators and utilities themselves, as well as, again, the industry, technology manufacturers, state and federal agencies, and advocates. So what are the key implications and what does the IEEE 1547-2018 standard do? In essence, it requires all DERs to be capable of providing specific grid supportive functionalities relating to voltage, frequency, communications, and controls. The new standard also addresses the increasing aggregate DER impacts on the bulk power system, and that's definitely a new space and an exciting opportunity to start to bridge the gap between the bulk system and the distribution system. With these functions enabled, DERs are going to have the ability to automatically respond to the grid conditions, thus avoiding potential negative impacts and maintaining and increasing the stability and reliability of the grid. It's also going to make DERs smarter and the distribution grid itself more optimized in terms of how DERs are deployed. And most importantly, perhaps from a broader environmental and/or industry impact perspective, the more DERs that are capable of responding to grid conditions, there will be opportunities to connect more DERs to the grid where perhaps they weren't able to before and enable higher penetrations of DERs. On the flip side, with the increased responsiveness to grid conditions, some customers may see shifts in their distribution generation output or see shifts in how their system is operated. So it will require attention on the consumer impacts and perhaps new consumer protection measures to make sure consumers are not unduly impacted. And then, of course, and relevant to today's conversation, the interconnection processes will need to be adapted and updated to reflect the new standard. And any current rules that are referencing the 2003 version should ideally be updated to reflect the updated version. So what is the timeline for this full rollout of the standard? So it's been published, but there are still a few years before it will be fully mainstream. The next step is already underway, which is the publication of the IEEE 1547.1, which is the conformance test procedures for equipment. And it's really basically what all the equipment is going to be tested to. And then the underwriter's laboratory will then quickly update the inverter product safety standard 1741. And they're working closely with IEEE to do that. And then from that point, the tested and certified 1547-2018 compliant DER products will be available on the market by the years 2021 or 2022. Nonetheless, early consideration of the standard will really be necessary because of the complexity that I mentioned. And let's see. So in my remaining time, I'm gonna just do a flyover of a couple of the core issues in the 2018 standard that you should all be aware of. So there are two core performance categories for DER grid functionality. The normal operating performance category specifies how the DER should perform with respect to voltage control during normal grid operations. And the abnormal operating performance category specifies how DERs should perform during short-term voltage or frequency grid disturbances, such as transmission faults or a loss of a generator. And within each of these categories, there are options to further clarify the performance and functional capabilities. And then the assignment of these categories is going to determine the DER's capability to respond to those grid conditions. It's important to note that different DER technologies are capable of different levels of performance. For example, inverters used with solar PV and energy storage are generally capable of the highest level of performance for both the normal and abnormal conditions, whereas other technologies may not be able to accommodate that higher level of performance. So why does this all matter? Well, assigning these categories to the different DER types is going to affect both the local power quality and the bulk grid stability in the long run, since these systems can all be online for 20 to 30 plus years. Within the normal category, again, it determines how DERs can provide voltage regulation and effectively provide reactive power for voltage control purposes, which IEEE requires. And there are a number of different reactive power or voltage regulation functions that can be enabled. But the main takeaway, and I'm going to spare you the technical explanation on each of these and refer you to the webinar I mentioned earlier. But the main takeaway is that IEEE 1547 specifies that voltage regulation functions will be, as a default, that there will be no voltage regulation. So if we want DERs to actually be able to respond to voltage situations on the grid and actually have a more responsive functionality, states and utilities are going to need to clarify which regulation function they want enabled and which DERs have to be required to do that, and then adjust from that standard default accordingly. It's important to note also, as I mentioned, that the settings will have different customer impacts in terms of energy production losses, and there are also some considerations that need to be made as it relates to what sort of expectation of control and who gets to decide when these functions are enabled. Besides simply maintaining power quality for all customers, what are some other reasons why voltage regulation should be adopted earlier on? In other words, why should we not just use the default of no regulation, no voltage regulation, and why should we consider adopting more proactive voltage regulation functions? Well, first, the ability to regulate voltage may allow some DERs to connect in places where it would have been more challenging before, perhaps where a grid upgrade would have been otherwise necessary to keep within voltage limits. Secondly, it can possibly increase the hosting capacity of a circuit by raising the number of DERs that can connect before a voltage limit is exceeded. Third, the effectiveness of voltage regulation can be optimized if most or all of the DERs are participating in voltage regulation. It can be very challenging to turn on the voltage regulation function in the future. So if you get to a high penetration scenario and you haven't turned any of that voltage regulation function on for any of those DERs, you basically lost the opportunity, or it becomes very difficult and cost ineffective to do so thereafter. And if only a small number of them are able to respond to voltage regulation, it doesn't really address the high penetration scenario. Within the abnormal operating performance category, which again is how reliably the DERs can maintain generation during bulk grid disturbances and what sort of impact they have on the bulk power system, also known as the ride-through requirements, these determine the capability of a DER to continue operating or not trip off during these abnormal frequency and voltage events. Within this category, there are a number of performance levels. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on these, but they're explained in the resource and in the webinar. But a key point I'll point out here, within these categories and deciding what makes the most sense, if you're in a market with a regional reliability coordinator, an RTO, an ISO, or a transmission operator, you will need to be coordinating and consulting with them because it affects their system. In addition to the performance categories, IEEE covers a number of topics that are going to affect DERs and DER aggregation. I don't have time to really speak to these, but I will just mention that the grid supportive functionality mentioned thus far within the different performance categories can operate autonomously by reacting to the local measurements of voltage or frequency as necessary. However, the eventual adoption of communications and controls is really going to be key to unlocking the full potential of DERs on the grid. And 1547-2018 requires DERs to include provisions for local DER communication interfaces, which could allow more benefits to be realized through monitoring, direct control, and adjusting the settings over time. In the context of interconnection rules and tariffs and guidance documents, these are all going to be needing to specify which DERs are going to be required to integrate with communication systems and what communication protocols the utilities will need to use to allow for that interface. So expect this to be an evolving and riveting discussion. So wrapping up here, although there's a timeline for the full rollout and implementation of the standard, and it is a few years out, there are a number of compelling reasons for states and utilities and the DER industry to begin grappling with the standards now, to determine where the standards are going to reside, which performance categories are going to be set as defaults or not, what the default settings will be, and the timeline for implementation. And lastly, as I said, this standard is going to have an impact on interconnection standards and the review process for all DERs. Given the complex menu of options, we should really be aiming for as much consistency and harmonization among different utilities and across states as possible. And those states that move more quickly will be better equipped to optimize DERs and avoid negative impacts on the grid as penetration levels increase. But even in states where DER penetration is low today, implementing the new standard will help ensure that forthcoming DERs in the future will be capable of accommodating the most updated performance standards and will avoid the preponderance of legacy DERs on the grid. And of course, settings commissioned today are going to be challenging to change, as I mentioned. So looking further ahead to the future, we'll definitely ensure that we get as many DERs on the grid as possible. And you can access all of IREC's free resources at our website, irecusa.org. We have a number of them relating to hosting capacity analysis, interconnection standards, energy storage, and our newest resources will also be housed there. I think that is all today for me, and I am happy to take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Reminder to everyone that you can type questions in the chat box, which should appear on the left side of your screen. Just have a couple minutes here for some Q&A directly with Sarah, and we'll have some more time at the very end of the webinar. I guess briefly just to start, you mentioned updating from the 2003 version to the new 2018 version. What's involved in that process, and do you foresee any challenges in getting new standards through? Is that likely to be a stumbling block as those are adopted?
Yeah, well, I'll speak from the experience we're having right now in Minnesota, which is one of the few states that's actually moving full speed ahead to update their technical standards document to reflect the new 2018 standard. We are about, I want to say, 6 months into this effort. I anticipate another 6 months to get to some sort of an agreement with utilities, advocates, and industry on how the new how the IEEE 1547-2018 standard will be integrated into the technical standards document to reference for interconnection standards. And you know, Minnesota is an interesting place because it's got a fairly low penetration of DERs today, but there's a lot of expectation of growth over time, and so we're kind of bridging the gap between being able to finalize some standards that make sense for today's market, but also anticipate growth over the forthcoming years. So I would definitely keep a close watch on Minnesota. Obviously, California and Hawaii have been at this for a while. They actually started before IEEE 2018 was 1547-2018 was finalized, and now they're in an interesting position of having to kind of go back and harmonize with IEEE 1547-2018. So the short answer is it's going to be hard, but the more states that start to grapple with it, and the more we get sort of a sense of familiarity with both the performance categories and some of these other technical standards, I expect that it will become easier over time. So,
great, thanks. Kind of a good question to segue to. We have, can you comment on how 1547 affects the current PJM interconnection process for storage?
I actually cannot, but the next speaker may be able to speak to that, because most of our work really deals with the distribution system. I'm much less familiar with the PJM process, but I do know that PJM is very involved and paying very close attention to the IEEE 1547-2018 implementation.
Okay, and what about for DC coupled microgrids?
So, yeah, that's a good question. As I mentioned, there are some provisions in IEEE 1547-2018 that speak to microgrids and intentional islands. However, it's my understanding that there is now a whole new work group and related sort of set of substandards, for lack of a better term, that's going to flesh that out in greater detail. But there's not a lot of specificity other than the standard basically says there should be some provisions that address this more explicitly in interconnection.
Great, thanks. And last brief question before we move on to Michael. For a product deployed on the grid today and 2003 compliant, do we envision requirements to update legacy equipment?
Yeah, another really good question, and this is definitely a topic of discussion in California as well as Hawaii, and I would expect that in most states there's not going to be a requirement for retrofit of existing 2003 compliant products, but there may be a requirement if a project, say, triggers the need for a new inverter. In other words, if your inverter goes out and you need to replace it, then there may be some states that say, or utilities that say, that new inverter needs to be 2018 compliant. But that is all very much subject to discussion and decision by states and utilities. That's not predetermined in the IEEE 1547-2018 standard.
Great. Well, thanks so much. All right. Now we'll next move to our second speaker, Michael Goggin, who will discuss standards interconnection more towards the transmission and wholesale level. So, Michael, take it away.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Tom. And just as a little bit of background, I'm at Grid Strategies, which is a small two-person consulting firm here in the D.C. area. I was at the American Wind Energy Association for the preceding 10 years, and that's why I have much more background in the utility scale transmission world than in the DER world. My partner and I work on mostly utility scale issues. Some of you may know him. He's Rob Gramlich. He's been around for a while at FERC and the ISOs. So yeah, just now we're working on with a variety of clients in the clean energy sector on interconnection issues at the ISOs and FERC, but also my particular focus has been on NERC lately. So I'm going to be talking a lot about that, what's going on at NERC as it regards interconnection standards. So just first to kind of briefly overview what we're talking about when we're talking about reliability standards. And I think Sarah covered a lot of this really well. Batteries can provide a number of services to the grid. In IEEE 1547, Sarah was discussing the reactive voltage control as well as the ride-through issues. And those are going to be a primary focus of what I'm going to talk about today, just with regard to the transmission connected or the bulk electric system. But there's obviously a number of other services batteries can provide, and I think most folks should be aware of these because they're basically utilizing the charging and discharging of the battery resource to provide a variety of frequency services. So, particularly fast power injections following a disturbance in frequency response, as well as, the more gradual frequency regulation and then ramping and peak energy products. So there really is a lot of capability out there, and I think our role is to make sure that the standards and the market design evolves in a way that utilizes these really excellent capabilities of the resource. So just a little bit of background for those who aren't kind of familiar with the regulatory world. FERC essentially created NERC, or gave NERC the authority to be the Electric Reliability Organization. NERC has been around for a while, but it was a kind of voluntary utility partnership that for most of its life. In 2005, following the 2003 blackout, FERC made NERC the Electric Reliability Organization, which gave it a number of authorities to create mandatory and enforceable reliability standards. And FERC still approves those standards, and FERC also maintains a large interconnection agreement pro forma that is widely used. But NERC has a lot of authority to create these standards, enforce the standards, which it does through audits, and then also do voluntary guidelines, reports, and then a variety of other issues like that to shine light on reliability issues that it sees. And so I'm going to be talking a lot about what's going on at NERC because they really are the entity where a lot of these discussions are happening today. So on the next slide, you can see that I wanted to kind of clarify that most NERC standards apply based on what is defined as the bulk electric system. And this definition was revised a couple of years ago to clarify how it treats dispersed resources. I think they're primarily thinking of wind and solar when they did that, but I think it also would apply to batteries as well. And you can see the definition here. So any single generator that has a megawatt, you can translate MVA as megawatt for most purposes. Greater than 20 megawatts would apply, based on the nameplate of the individual generator. However, if you've got, a bunch of, 2 megawatt wind plant, wind turbines, or, a bunch of 1 megawatt PV arrays integrated, or, 1 megawatt batteries integrated into a plant that's larger than 75 megawatts, that also becomes a bulk electric system and becomes subject to a number of these NERC standards. And so in terms of what's really been some of the most active issues at NERC lately, a lot of it has come out of the PV side. I'm going to talk a lot about that because it's, the inverters that are used for PV resources are essentially identical, and in many cases the same technology as that's used for batteries. And so I think many of the issues that are being dealt with for with a primary focus on PV are exactly applicable to what batteries are going to be dealing with, as they, particularly as we see more utility scale, large installations. And so this is, the chart here shows what happened in, this is a Southern California Edison footprint, and so Southern California in 2016. So they had a number of PV generators drop out when there was a fault on the grid. So, faults on the grid happen all the time, lightning or, something happens and a transmission line or a large generator goes out and voltage and frequency kind of swing around. So, basically it's important that the grid be able to withstand that and the other generators don't go offline when you have an event like that. Well, as you can see in this event, this is, again, the solar output. There were several very obvious drops over the course of that day as transmission lines tripped. This is due to a wildfire. There was a wildfire, a very large fire in the southern part of the state that caused several transmission lines to go out of service suddenly. And that caused a voltage disturbance that then took offline a good number of these inverters. And you can see them dropping out there. So kind of coming out of this event, there's been a few other events in California where you're seeing similar behavior. And so NERC got, I think, very concerned about this. And so for the last 2 years, a little more than that now, they've been doing a lot of work on inverter-based resources. And so just a little bit on the technical side here. So kind of, it was driving some of this. Some of it was just the way that the inverters were performing. They were reading frequency and voltage too quickly, which basically they saw for a few cycles that the voltage or frequency appeared to drop really drastically, and so they would then the system is way out of bounds. Voltage or frequency has exceeded the thresholds that we're supposed to stay on for, and then would drop the resource. And that was actually not the case. Those were kind of erroneous readings as the system kind of swung around. So that was part of the problem. You also had some issues with basically the PRC 24 standard. I'll talk about that in a minute, but people were misinterpreting. There was a section of that standard that said that it is permissible to trip your unit in this area, and people interpreted that standard as saying you must trip if you have this type of voltage excursion, and that obviously contributed to this problem. And then there's finally some inverters are programmed with a setting called momentary cessation, where the resource stops injecting current when there's for a short period of time when there's a disturbance on the grid. And that's, I think, one of the issues that's still being dealt with at NERC as we work through these standards issues. So on the next slide, there's really quite a bit of content of what's going on at NERC right now. And sorry, you can see that so there's these over the last year they've done voluntary guidelines to address some of the issues that have come out of that fire and the other events, and that's been where a lot of the focus is. And I think that's really driven a lot of the industry performance in terms of improving how these inverters are set. So there was a lot of retrofitting, of reprogramming, typically done just through a software push, a firmware update, where they push out an update to the program for the inverters that would, change how they were sampling voltage and frequency, and basically allow them to better ride through events like this. So I think that's really the participation in the industry, particularly on the PV and the inverter side, has been great. I think has really helped a lot with addressing some of those concerns that we're seeing. We've seen the performance in a few more recent events markedly better than it was during that first event, the Blue Cut fire that I showed you. So then there's also, NERC is now kind of at the stage this year where it's going to be moving into the revisions to the mandatory enforceable standards. And so I think this is kind of the stakes are getting higher because this is where things actually do have the force of law, and you can be subject to significant financial penalties if you're not compliant. And so there are two primary standards that are about to enter the revision process and are having drafting teams set up at NERC to deal with them. And so the first is the PRC-24, which is basically the relay, so the protective controls that protect all generators. In inverters, those are used to, say if the voltage or the frequency goes out of certain bounds, the plant's going to disconnect to protect itself, and from the system. And so that was the primary issue that we saw, where you had the large amount of that PV generation dropping out. And so there's an effort to clarify many aspects of that PRC-24 standard of what is expected of inverters and how they treat these disturbances, how they ride through. Similarly in PRC-19, and this is just this process is just getting started. It hasn't gone to a drafting team yet, but that standard was written for large synchronous generators, and there are many sections of it that don't really clearly, it's not clear how they apply to dispersed and inverter-based resources. And so there's a lot of clarifications that need to be done, but it also is likely to cover some aspects of the momentary cessation and how that should be treated for the voltage controls and protection controls. So again, a lot of this is really related to these ride-through issues of how inverters behave when there's a system disturbance. And that's also, I think it's very much in parallel with what's going on at the IEEE 1547 level. And to briefly answer the question that was posed a little bit earlier, that is, I think, what PJM has been interested in is, obviously PJM is only has jurisdiction over the bulk system, but they have been looking at ride through and a variety of performance issues for all resources, and they clearly want utility scale resources to be riding through, but to the extent they have the authority to kind of work with states and others that have the jurisdiction over distributed resources, I think they're trying to create standardization as much as possible and developing a solution there. So I think that's kind of the primary, as my understanding is, that's what's going on at PJM, is that they're working on just across the distributed and utility scale realms, getting a better sense of how inverters will perform and creating standards for how they are expected to ride through events like this. So so those are kind of the big inverter-based issues that are going on at NERC, and I think this activity is really wrapping up. This inverter-based resources performance task force has a meeting next month, and they're kind of planning their agenda for the year. So I do encourage you, particularly if you're developing these larger systems that will be covered by NERC standards, to get engaged. I think it's important that we work out how these rules will work in a way that works for the industry, but also ensures that we are good stewards and good citizens of the grid and help to maintain reliability. That's really, I think, critical for the long-term growth of the industry, is to be good stewards of the grid and really utilize the services that batteries can provide. So other things that are going on at NERC, they issue reliability reports on a regular basis, and so this is it's important to kind of monitor these and make sure that these reports are accurately accounting for the contributions and capabilities of new resources like storage, and also properly understanding some of these issues that we've seen. And then there's an interesting potential assessment that's just getting started. They're looking at, and this is still a proposal, looking at the role of microgrids, renewables, and energy storage. So I think something that we'll need to look at, not clear exactly where that's going. On the DER side, so NERC is obviously just the bulk system, but at times they do get interested in how distributed resources affect the bulk system, and so that's the SPIDER, which is a great acronym, working group. They want to understand how the DERs are affecting and how they're accounted for on the bulk system. And then, sorry, just drink a little water. And then finally, so there's some data reporting requirements that may be imposed for inverters based on, again, coming out of these ride-through issues. People may want to look at how, having better collection of data. So we want to make sure that this is done in a reasonable way, and doesn't require massive amounts of data to be reported. And then a couple of just ongoing issues that NERC is always thinking about. frequency response, how inverter-based resources can contribute to that, how they affect inertia, things like that. And then also just the physical and cybersecurity, which are, I think, always hot topics at NERC. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Michael. Again, you can ask any questions in the chat box on the left side of your screen. First question we have here, how do you think the NERC efforts could be built upon to address resiliency? Do you think NERC will extend its efforts to resiliency and interrelate reliability and resiliency?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So resiliency has kind of been the hot word of the day. It used to be smart grid. Now it's resiliency. And I think people have been using it to try to justify a lot of things. I do think, the storage industry and, other inverter-based resources have a great story to tell because, the technical capabilities to ride through events is much greater than that of conventional synchronous generators because, again, the power electronics and the inverters provide electrical isolation from the power system that allows you to, on a technical basis, do a much better job of riding through a voltage or frequency disturbance than most conventional generators can. And so I think there's a good resilience story there. Obviously, a key part of resilience is keeping online when there's a grid problem. But then certainly, all the things that batteries can do in terms of keeping voltage and frequency within acceptable bounds. That's, I think, when you have responding to disturbances and just during normal operations, I think there's a great story about how batteries provide a flexible resource to the system that makes it resilient to all types of events. So I think, I think, in terms of how reliability and resilience relate, I think most people understand that many of the NERC reliability rules are geared around improving resilience, and so I think there's a strong relationship between those. People have traditionally kind of, thought that the reliability standards we have also encompass resilience. So I think, there will continue to be a lot of things that at NERC and elsewhere to help address some of these concerns about resilience. And I think batteries are well positioned to be a part of that solution.
Great, thanks. The next question we have is the 75 MVA trigger level a hard one? Example, the questioner asked if we're building a 75 MVA system but have to oversize in order to deliver 75 MVA at the POI, does that trigger NERC requirements, and what do those requirements look like?
Yeah, so let me scroll back to this slide here copies pretty exactly the language from NERC, and this was signed off on at FERC that governs this. So these are the exact criteria. So again, it's based on nameplate rating, which again I guess could be a little tricky when we have AC versus DC issues and things like that. And so I don't want to venture. I'm not a FERC lawyer. I don't want to venture off into making up an answer here, but I think this language is the language from the standard, and so I'll just put this forward and let you judge how that would be interpreted. I don't want to go beyond that because I think there could be FERC legal issues of how this, and if it's unclear, this is something that we could through NERC processes try to clarify. Again, I think this was written more than 5 years ago, before a lot of these, oversizing DC system issues were relevant. But my guess is that it would mostly apply on the AC. I mean, that's what the bulk system is concerned about is, the MVA that's coming across the point of interconnection. So I would guess that's the standard, and that would be used. But again, don't take that to FERC.
Great, thanks. So there are a lot of different configurations for DERs, as we've spoken a little bit about today, both you and Sarah. Do the NERC or the IEEE standards have enough flexibility or breadth in their definitions to catch everything in a coherent or fair way?
That's I can from my view, I mean that's it's a pretty high standard, and I think it's just a continual learning effort. I mean, most of these standards were written with conventional generators in mind, many years ago, and so I think there's a lot of updating that needs to be done to make them make sense for inverter-based and smaller resources. I think there's also, just a lot of learning that people need. There's a lot of people in the industry, utility industry at large, that just don't have a lot of familiarity with these resources. So there's certainly a lot of education that needs to go on. And then, I think we need to, as we get into much higher renewable and inverter-based penetrations with, much higher storage penetrations, I think we need to think about if we were redesigning the power system from scratch. So you kind of, totally abandoning everything we had, how do we do it? We probably do a lot of things very differently to utilize these really great capabilities for fast control, fast response from inverter-based, renewables and storage. And so I think that's kind of the direction we need to be evolving towards. But it's going to be a long process. And I'd certainly say that, at this point, I think there's a lot of standards and other things at NERC, and I think NERC would admit this, that need to be updated and need to better account for these new resources.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just add that I'll just very quickly, Tom. The IEEE standard is at once it's simultaneously specific, but then it leaves a lot of flexibility for states and utilities to kind of determine what makes the most sense. So I think we're going to see a lot of variation if we're not careful, and we're certainly hoping to see, as I said earlier, more consistency across utilities and state lines, because the more variation through interpretation we see, the harder it's going to be for DER providers and developers to know the rules of the road, and also we could get really quagmired in all sorts of different settings being applied, and then the grid actually not being able to function as efficiently and optimally as we had intended, or as they had intended with the standard. So.
Great, thanks. Are there any NERC standards for distribution 12 kV aggregated solar with storage?
No, the BS definition is what I have there, and it's 100 kV and up, and that's the rule. To my knowledge, at that level, it's there are no NERC rules. It would all be kind of the distribution level rules under IEEE 1547 and other stuff that would apply.
Great, thanks. Regarding kind of talking about issues of interconnection queues, we hear a lot about DERs languishing in interconnection queues. Do we have a sense of where standards like these are likely to impact that? Is it creating a level of sort of standardization that utilities can look to and ease that process, or not?
Well, I would say, I'm sorry. Sorry, Mark.
No.
Mike, what I would say on the distribution side quickly, we are seeing a lot of backlogs in the queue due largely to the fact that either timelines aren't being enforced, or the study processes are taking much longer than they should due to either lack of familiarity or comfort with DER operations. And I think the IEEE standard certainly can help in that backlog scenario if applied correctly, and if there's a comfort in assuming that DERs are going to operate the way they are intended to. But I wouldn't hang my hat on these standards fixing the queue issues that we are seeing. There's going to be a need for much more specific strategies to address those issues in addition to this standard on the distribution side.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Yeah, for the utility side, I would just say that I think we've had a good amount of standardization. I think that was one of the great things that the large generator interconnection agreement standardization that FERC helped achieve, was that there is a pretty standard set of interconnection agreements and interconnection standards. I do think there are a lot of issues that need to be addressed to help storage better move through the the interconnection queue. FERC has taken a lot of action, or has taken some action on that. There's an ongoing rulemaking where they've issued an order, and I think they're waiting for compliance filings on the interconnection process to better streamline that. And that was initiated by a lot of the renewable groups. I think it would have benefits for storage as well to have better accountability and a faster study and interconnection process. I think there is one area that needs to be looked at is hybrid projects where people are adding or want to have storage in combination with other types of generation, often renewable, but it doesn't have to be. I think there needs to be better ways to make sure that adding storage doesn't constitute a material modification and basically require you to be kicked out of the grid, out of the queue, and then go back to square one with your queue application, which can take a very long period of time. And then also issues related to how spare capacity. So basically, if you're installing storage behind a point of interconnection, and you don't plan to ever exceed your maximum interconnection, your maximum injection limit at that point of interconnection, it seems like to me that you should be able to use that and without requiring a new, totally new queue position and things like that. So those issues I think are still to be resolved. Basically for the hybrid projects, just something people didn't think about when even a few years ago when some of these rulemakings were being done.
Great, thanks. The next question we have, do you anticipate critical infrastructure protection reliability standards that may apply significantly to significantly large-sized aggregated 12 kV DERs in the future?
Sarah, you might want to talk a little bit more about the how that works at the distribution system level. So the SIP standards are those typically cover cybersecurity and issues like that. I'm not a complete expert on that topic. I've not focused too much on that. And obviously, I think there are, even though these are small resources, there are aspects of the control. You don't want a malicious actor able to get in and control the resource and do things like that. But I think in general they're not covered by many of the more onerous requirements for cybersecurity that apply to the larger facilities, just because those can have a much larger impact on the bulk system. But Sarah might have more insight there.
The only thing I would say is that on the distribution system, this is really another emerging and quickly moving topic of discussion that does not have resolution. California in particular has been moving forward with their implementation of their hosting capacity maps, and through that process some of these cybersecurity issues and questions have arisen, and right now the Commission is requiring the utilities to publish data and make transparent the maps and underlying system information, but there's quite a bit of pushback from the utilities on how much data should be shared and whether or not it impacts the critical infrastructure requirements that they're subject to. So I would say this is an area of focus for us and should be hopefully for the industry as well. We definitely need to kind of get clearer about what is and is not subject to the SIP and any other needs to protect critical data on the distribution system, but it's not clearly defined.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. That brings us to 4:30. Thanks so much for joining us on this webinar. Thanks so much to our speakers for their thoughts on this very important topic. Before we leave you, mention our February 13th Energy Policy Forum, which is here in DC. Link there on your screen. Hope some of you will be able to join us. If you have any questions regarding any upcoming events or webinars, or would like to submit an idea for a future webinar, please email us at education@energystorage.org. Thank you again to our presenters. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.